The night was quiet, almost too quiet. A suburban home sat in darkness, its windows glowing faintly from the streetlight outside. Nothing appeared unusual, but inside, death was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. At 1:47 a.m., a 911 call shattered the silence. A woman's voice, frantic, trembling, laced with panic. "My husband, he's not breathing. He fell down the stairs. Please hurry." The sound of footsteps, the operator urging calm, the gasping voice on the other end. Then silence. When paramedics arrived, they found him sprawled at the base of the stairwell. His body bent awkwardly, his head tilted at a terrible angle. The tiles beneath him stained in deep crimson. His chest barely moved. His wife stood above him, shaking, her hands trembling as though she'd already seen the verdict written in blood. He was rushed to the hospital, but within hours, the man was gone. His life ended in what looked like a fall, an accident. But investigators would soon whisper another word, a darker word: murder. Because sometimes death at the bottom of the stairs isn't an accident. Sometimes it's the perfect crime. And so began one of the most chilling investigations the town had ever seen. A mystery of love, betrayal, and suspicion. A wife fighting to clear her name. A husband who could no longer speak for himself. And a stairwell that became a stage for secrets too dark to remain hidden. Tonight, we step into that house. We retrace the footsteps that ended in silence. We peel back the shadows of a marriage and follow a trail of evidence that twists between innocence and guilt. This is more than a fall. This is a death in the stairwell. It began like so many nights do, ordinary. A quiet evening, a shared meal, a couple winding down from the humdrum of life. But within hours, that normalcy would collapse. The wife claimed she was upstairs preparing for bed when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a crash, wood groaning, a body striking the floor. The kind of sound that freezes the blood. She ran down to the stairwell, and there in the dim light lay her husband, motionless. The paramedics' report would later detail the scene with clinical precision. Male subject found supine at bottom of stairs. Severe trauma to the head. Pooling blood observed on tile floor. Wife present on scene, visibly distressed. But detectives arriving minutes later saw more than just tragedy. They saw questions. If this was a fall, why were the injuries so severe? Why was the blood spatter pattern angled in a way that suggested force, not a stumble? And why, if he simply tripped, did it appear his body landed too far from the final step? Neighbors would later describe the scene outside the home. Police cars with flashing lights, officers whispering to one another, casting sideways glances at the woman standing in her driveway. Her robe wrapped tight around her, her face pale in the blue glow. "She looked like a ghost," one neighbor recalled, "but I couldn't tell if it was grief or guilt." From the very first night, the stairwell whispered secrets, and investigators leaned in to listen. He was not the kind of man you'd expect to find at the bottom of a stairwell, blood pooling beneath his head. Friends would later say he was cautious, careful, almost methodical in everything he did. He locked doors twice before bed. He walked deliberately, step by step, as if measuring each movement. He was not reckless, he was not clumsy. To his colleagues, he was the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence. Respectable, reliable, the sort of person who showed up early, stayed late, and rarely raised his voice. He worked hard, paid his bills, kept his life in order. But at home, things were different. Neighbors remembered the arguments, low voices at first, then louder, rising above the television hum, spilling into the night. "Every marriage has its problems," one neighbor said, "but theirs seemed heavier." The wife would later insist they had their ups and downs like anyone else. Yes, there were disagreements. Yes, sometimes they fought. But love remained. She said they were building a life together, trying to weather storms. And that night, she swore, was no different. Still, investigators began peeling back the layers of who this man truly was. On the surface, the dutiful husband. Beneath it, a portrait blurred with contradictions. He was generous, yes, but also proud, unwilling to admit weakness. He was gentle at times, but could turn cold in the middle of an argument. He was admired by friends, yet carried private frustrations that even his closest confidants didn't fully understand. And there were secrets, emails he never mentioned, bank withdrawals unaccounted for, small cracks in the mirror of the life he presented to the world. The last night of his life was a puzzle of ordinary details. He'd eaten dinner at the table, laughed once or twice, then retreated to the living room. A glass of wine rested half-empty on the counter. A phone call, short and clipped, ended with the sound of a door closing. Then silence. By the time his body was found at the bottom of the stairs, the man he had been was gone, and what remained was only the story others would tell about him. The medical examiner's first notes were chilling. Multiple lacerations to the skull, bruises not entirely consistent with a single fall, a fractured wrist as if he'd tried to break his descent. But one detail stood out, the depth of the wound at the back of his head. The kind of injury that might occur from hitting the floor, or from something else entirely. As the body was wheeled away under the sterile glow of the coroner's van, neighbors watched from their windows, whispering. He was such a decent man, one said. How could this have happened to him? But behind closed doors, detectives were asking another question. If he was as careful as everyone claimed, then how did he end up dead at the bottom of the stairs? The victim's story was no longer about the man he had been in life. It was now about the enigma he left behind. His blood told one story, his wife told another. And somewhere between those two versions of reality, the truth was waiting to be unearthed. The husband was gone. But his stairwell death was only beginning to haunt the living. She was the first to see him, the first to cry out, the first to call for help. When the police arrived, she looked every bit the part of a grieving wife. Eyes swollen, cheeks streaked with tears, hands trembling as she clutched her robe around her shoulders. He fell, she repeated, again and again, as if the words themselves could explain the horror at the bottom of the stairs. It was just a fall. He slipped, but from that very night, suspicion followed her like a shadow. To some investigators, her grief seemed too controlled, her words too precise. There was a tremor in her voice, yes, but not the wild, incoherent panic they expected. It's not that she wasn't emotional, one officer later recalled. It's that her emotion felt measured. Neighbors, too, had their stories. They remembered the shouting behind closed doors, the arguments that bled through thin walls. They fought hard, one said, and when you fight that hard, you wonder what happens when tempers go too far. The wife insisted those claims were exaggerated. Yes, they quarreled, but who didn't? Yes, voices were raised, but love endured. And she had no reason at all, to want her husband dead. But the whispers grew louder when detectives reviewed the medical examiner's preliminary findings. The injuries didn't look quite right. Too severe, too inconsistent. The kind of wounds that raised the question no grieving widow wants to hear. Did someone help him down those stairs? And who else, if not her? In interviews, she painted herself as a devoted partner. She spoke of their shared routines, their laughter, their struggles. She said she adored him, that his death had torn her world apart. Yet investigators noted something odd. Her tone shifted when pressed about their marriage. At times, her answers were tender, at others, cold and defensive. Then came the inconsistencies. She said she was upstairs when it happened, But her timeline wavered under scrutiny. How long had she been in the bedroom? Had she heard anything before the fall? Why did it take precious minutes before she dialed 911? Every answer seemed to breed another question. Friends were divided. Some rallied to her defense, describing her as gentle, devoted, incapable of harm. Others hesitated. One admitted she had a temper. "I've seen her lash out before. I'm not saying she did it, but I wouldn't be shocked if she lost control." The wife, meanwhile, lived under a cloud she could not escape. In public, she avoided stares that lingered too long. In private, she told anyone who would listen that she was innocent, that she was being framed by circumstance and suspicion. But suspicion can be louder than truth. Detectives soon uncovered emails between the couple, arguments carried into the digital world, words typed in anger that now looked like clues. There were mentions of money, of trust broken, of nights spent apart. There was a tone of bitterness, the suggestion of wounds too deep to fully heal. And so the narrative shifted. What had begun as a tragedy was being recast as a crime. The wife was no longer just a grieving widow. She was the prime suspect in her husband's death. The stairwell had claimed his life, but it had also ensnared hers. Because from that moment on, she was trapped between two realities. The version of events she swore was true, and the version investigators believed was hiding in the shadows. Was she a woman wrongly accused, the victim of cruel suspicion? Or was she a killer in disguise, playing the role of widow while concealing the truth of what happened that night? The answer lay somewhere within the cracks of her story and the cold silence of the stairwell. The house had grown silent after the ambulance pulled away, but the stairwell remained alive with echoes. For detectives, silence is never empty. Silence hums with evidence. They began with the scene itself. Each photograph captured what the human eye might overlook: the position of the body, the angles of blood spatter, the faint smudges on the banister. Every detail was a whisper, waiting to be decoded. The husband had been found sprawled at the base of the stairs, head tilted against the tile. Blood had pooled outward in a jagged halo. But here was the first problem. The blood didn't match a straight fall. It spread at an angle, almost as if his head had struck the floor with unnatural force. "Notice this pattern," one investigator murmured, pointing to the photographs. "It's not consistent with a simple tumble. It's consistent with impact." The forensic team measured the distance from the final step to where his body lay. Too far. If he'd tripped naturally, momentum would have carried him forward differently. Instead, the spread suggested a shove, sudden, violent, deliberate. Then came the injuries. The autopsy revealed multiple fractures to the skull, bruising along the arms, and a fractured wrist. The wrist wound was telling. An instinctive injury, the kind that occurs when someone throws out their hands to break a fall. But the bruises on his forearms, those looked like something else. Grabbing, struggling, resisting. The wife repeated her story. She had been upstairs, preparing for bed, when she heard the crash. But detectives noticed the timeline didn't quite fit. When exactly did she hear it? How quickly had she reacted? Why did the 911 call come later than expected, given the severity of his injuries? Suspicion hardened further when investigators examined the stairwell itself. On the wooden railing just below the midpoint of the staircase, a faint smear of blood was discovered. Its placement didn't make sense. If he'd fallen naturally, his hands wouldn't have reached there, unless, of course, someone else's hand had been gripping him, pressing him against the wood before the final descent. And there was another troubling detail. Beneath his fingernails, faint traces of skin cells. A sample was collected, sealed, and rushed to the lab. If it matched hers, the narrative of accident would collapse entirely. But the investigation wasn't just about science. It was about psychology. Detectives questioned her repeatedly, searching for cracks in her composure. Sometimes she wept, sometimes she lashed out in frustration, sometimes she sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the table. Each reaction was noted, dissected, interpreted. "You say you were upstairs," one detective pressed, "but your husband was bleeding out just feet away. Why didn't you hear him call out?" She shook her head, voice breaking. "I don't know. I didn't hear anything until he was already gone." But doubt clung to her words. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the community. Rumors of marital discord, financial stress, a relationship fraying under pressure. Each new detail fed the growing suspicion that the stairwell had not claimed him by chance. The detectives began building their timeline. Dinner finished at 8:30 p.m. A phone call, short, tense, ended around 9:15. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices near 10. At 1:47 a.m., the 911 call came through. What happened in those missing hours between the last argument and the discovery of his body? One neighbor claimed she heard a thud earlier than the official account. Another recalled the wife stepping outside briefly, her face pale, her hands clutching a phone. But memories blur in the dark. What was truth, and what was imagination? Still, piece by piece, the image sharpened. A man at the bottom of the stairs, injuries inconsistent with a simple fall, blood patterns that whispered of violence, a wife with motive and opportunity. The stairwell, once just part of a home, had become a crime scene, and every creak of its steps seemed to accuse her. Detectives prepared their case, convinced this was no accident. But in crimes like these, suspicion alone is not enough. They needed proof, evidence, a story that would hold in court. And so the wife was no longer just the woman who called 911. She was now the focus of a murder investigation. The stairwell had taken a life, but it was about to put another one on trial. The courtroom was a theater of dread. Wooden pews creaked as families, journalists, and strangers leaned forward, each breath held in anticipation. At the center of it all sat Barbara, the grieving widow, or the cold-blooded killer, depending on whom you believed. The air was thick with whispers. She pushed him. No, it was an accident. But why didn't she call for help right away? The prosecutor painted Barbara as a woman with a hidden darkness. They spoke of marital tensions, of quiet resentments building like a storm, of money troubles and whispered fights. Each piece of circumstantial evidence was twisted into a narrative of betrayal. And then came the most damning piece, the staircase itself. Experts dissected the angle of the steps, the force of the fall, the blood patterns staining the walls. Was it consistent with a stumble or a shove? The jury watched diagrams and listened to forensic experts describe the unthinkable. Barbara's defense attorney fought back with equal passion. They painted her as a loving wife, a woman whose world had been shattered in an instant. They reminded the jury of the frantic 911 call, the sobs that shook her voice, the disbelief of a woman who had just lost the love of her life. But the trial was more than evidence. It was theater. Every time Barbara's eyes welled with tears, cameras flashed. Every time the prosecutor spoke the word murder, a chill swept through the room. For weeks, the jury listened, torn between science and emotion, between a grieving widow and a calculating killer. The line between truth and performance blurred until even the most seasoned reporters admitted, "We can't tell anymore." And as the trial reached its climax, one haunting question lingered in the air. Was this tragedy born of a tragic misstep, or had a stairwell become the perfect weapon in a marriage built on secrets? The verdict would change everything. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The jury had been out for days, deliberating in secrecy, weighing every fragment of evidence, every sob, every drop of blood on the stairwell wall. Now, 12 solemn faces re-entered the room. The judge's gavel struck, echoing like a funeral bell. Barbara sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. The foreman rose. The paper in his trembling hand seemed heavier than stone. The world held still as he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The words dragged like chains across the air. Barbara's chest heaved. The spectators leaned forward, hearts pounding in unison. Even the reporters lowered their pens for just 1 second, knowing this was history in the making. And then, the verdict crashed like thunder. Gasps erupted. Some cried out in disbelief. Others nodded grimly, as though the outcome had been inevitable all along. Barbara closed her eyes, her body sinking into her chair as if the ground itself had given way beneath her. Whether it was freedom or life in prison, the moment carried a darkness no one could escape. Because in that stairwell, one man had lost his life, and now, with the verdict, another life was forever destroyed. The cameras flashed, the gavel struck again, and the story that had begun with a single scream in the night ended with a chilling reminder. Justice does not erase horror. It only marks the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. Long after the trial ended, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters went home, one thing remained unchanged: the stairwell. The narrow passage where it all began still stood in silence, its wooden steps creaking under the weight of memory. Neighbors whispered that no one could walk past it without feeling a chill crawl across their skin. Some swore they heard faint echoes, the sound of a body tumbling, the gasping cry of a man's last breath, the muffled sobs of a woman's voice pleading in the darkness. Even the investigators who worked the case admitted the place unsettled them. For some, it wasn't just a staircase anymore. It had become a symbol, a reminder that horror doesn't always come from monsters lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it comes from those we trust the most. And so the stairwell remained, a ghostly monument to unanswered questions. Was it an accident? Was it murder? Or was it something in between? An act born not of hatred, but of desperation? We may never know. But one truth lingers, carved deep into the silence of those steps. Death leaves behind more than victims. It leaves stories that never stop echoing. And if you listen closely, late at night, when the house is still, you might just hear the stairwell whisper its secret.